Hey guys, welcome back to another Maki guide video slash tutorial on how to utilize this absolute beast of a unit. Very strong unit, very detailed kit, also complex in the same breath. One of the best kits in the game for a DPS. Her only fallback is her ability, or not ability, but her con being prone to buff nerf where applicable in Tower because she doesn't have any unnerfable buffs compared to, for example, Toji, who has a 50% P-Tech or physical technique buff from Heavenly Restriction, which cannot be nerfed in Tower. She doesn't have that. Hers has a turn limit that activates when it's her turn, or when your team is going to take its turn again after the boss moves. So that's her only fallback. Everything else is very, very well built. Everything synergizes with each other. Her skills have so many effects. It's absolutely ridiculous. We're gonna look into that when I get into the skill descriptions later on. But for now, we're just gonna look at her kit and then see what everything else does. Alright, so this is how my Maki looks after spending 4 Unishards on her release date. As soon as her banner came out, I spent 4 Unishards on her. This was before SP Potential Floor 2 was added and Combo Ult buffs were added. So this was when it was just 21 out of 21 for her. She has 14.1k Taijutsu or physical technique stats at level 150. Also 35k health. So she's very bulky and has very high stats. The only thing is her ult gauge is almost 1.8k, one of the highest in the game for a DPS. But it's actually not a bad thing for her because of how her kit is built. So you'll almost always hit ult on turn 7 without any additional ult gauge fill modifications like Inumaki's S2 or Unity. So you look at her S1, it has a very average multiplier, 225% at level 10, but it allows her to have Unity built in. So it applies a 35% ult gauge fill rate to herself for 2 turns. So if she gets hit by a boss, you won't get the average 60 ult gauge per hit. This 60 would be increased by 35%, which would be roughly, what, 90 or so? I believe it's around 90. I don't have a calculator on me. But it'll be around 90 ult gauge per hit from the boss, as well as her base ult regen would be 220, and that will be amplified by the 35% ult gauge, right? And then she applies a state buff to herself. Well, not state buff, but just a state slash status. If you combo her S1 into her S2, which is Slashdown, it applies a 50% crit rate increase to herself for another 3 turns. Turns in this game are turn inclusive, so technically it's like a 2-turn buff, but that's for later on. As well as if you combo it into her S3, which is 1 Mighty Slash, the names are absolute garbage, but 1 Mighty Slash, she also gains another 15% ult gauge fill rate, and then she gets more ult gauge when you use the S3. Her S2 now is her self-buff skill, where you do 450% damage, very decent multiplier for an S2 at level 10. You also apply a 35% P-Tech increase to self for 3 turns, as well as increasing the damage taken decrease effect of her passive to 30%, as well as increasing her own evasion to 30% for the turn. And then it applies the Slashdown status for 2 turns. In the Slashdown status, I believe right, so after using S2 after S1, she applies an additional 25% P-Tech buff on top of her base 35% on the skill, which would give you a 50% P-Tech buff for 3 turns, right? And then additionally, if you use S2 after her S3, you get an additional 10% damage reduction for 3 turns. So it's like 4 different passives into one skill, and it's just because of her combo effect, right? So there will be cases where you can S1, S2, S2 to get like a massive spike in P-Tech buff to then S3 afterwards because of the high multiplier on S3, and you just do raw damage, right? And there's also cases where you'd use S1, S2, S1 to get the crit buff of her S1 so you can use it on her ult to get a very high crit, what do you call it now? A crit ratio, right? So you crit more often on her ult, except for the last hit. The last hit on her ult is always guaranteed to crit. So you just S1, S2, S1 to have a higher chance of critting on all 4 hits of her ult. Although it's a higher crit rate, it's lower raw damage compared to other combos. We'll talk about that later. Right, so now we're S3. At level 10, her S3 does 600% multiplier worth of damage, and then it applies a unique crit damage buff to herself. Crit damage buffs aren't new to the game, but they've never been good. The only crit damage buff we'd had before, I think, was Blue Momo. I think Blue Momo is the only unit that does crit buff to everyone, right? But it was shit. But now it's actually decent because a lot of the new units that are coming out have crit damage built into their kit with crit rate buffs, etc, etc. But moving on. After doing the massive burst damage of S3, she applies the One Mighty Slash status to herself. In this status, because of, as we know, her combo synergy kit, if you use S3 after S2, it doesn't give an effect. But if you use S3 after S1, it has an effect. So it give you more ult gauge than usual because you'd have the 35% from S1 as well as an additional 15% from S1 because you combo it from 1 to 3. You'd have a 50% ult gauge buff, ult gauge fill rate buff, plus you regen an additional 110 ult gauge after using the skill. So she doesn't need LMS, Light-Minded Sisters direct bid, but unique strategies would like it if you need to ult very, very early. It could be possible, but it's not needed. There's also an effect where just using the skill gives you the 50% crit damage increase itself for 3 turns. So there's a combo where her main highest damage combo is just skill 1, skill 2, skill 3, which gives you the 60% P-Tech buff actually, because S1 and S2 gives you 60%, right? It's 25% plus 35 is 6%. 60% P-Tech buff plus the 50% crit damage buff for her ult, and then that would be her highest nuke potential. It's not the highest crit potential because S1, S2, S1 is a higher crit rate chance, but you're doing lower damage overall because you're using S1 after S2 and not S3. So you're just wasting the 60% P-Tech buff on her S1, which is like 375% lower multiplier than her S3, right? Her ult, as basic as it is, it's just 1.2k multiplier, and then she just gets ult gauge. That's it. No additional effects. Everything else is baked into her core skills and her passive, and it's just ult. It's just ult, but the unique thing is she has a guaranteed crit on the last hit of the ult, as well as she recovers ult gauge after ulting. So you get to her next ult faster, right? Her first ult usually takes 7 turns inclusive, right? Inclusive of ult. So you have 6 turns of build up, and then the 7th turn you ult. The next ult afterwards though is a 6-turn ult. So you ult quicker after the first ult, right? Her passive though. The Fortune Favors the Bold is a very short passive. It applies once at the start of battle or a wave. If you're doing story with her, you get 10% P-Tech for 2 turns with a 7% damage reduction for 2 turns. That's it. Just for 2 turns, that's it. That's just for waves at the start of battle. That's it. Right? Her next passive though, which is her actual heavenly restriction, it allows her to have 30% P-Tech buff to self at the start of her turn, constantly, right? So the less people there are to fight, the stronger this effect becomes. For example, on 74, this buff would be 25% because there are two enemies. You have the main boss and the side mob. After killing the boss, it goes back up to 30%, but that difference is very minute. But the more enemies, the less the buff is, and it just becomes iffy. But it's still a very, very strong unit. But once you're focusing on one boss, it's always going to be 30%. As well as she has a base HP regen per turn to self, which is 2% of her base 35k without rec bit buffs, etc. etc. There's also a 8% damage taken decrease to herself, as well as a chance evasion, which is at 10% at base. We already seen earlier on her S2 where just using S2 gives her the buff to evasion, becoming a 30% rate to evade. Right, so she's harder to hit, takes less damage after being hit regardless, and she regens her HP after the turn ends. So no matter how much damage she realistically takes, she eventually just full heals completely over the course of the fight. So she just dodges periodically, she will dodge, as well as just taking less damage overall. Alright guys, so welcome to phase 2 and one of the most important phases in this video. Her skill combos and how and why they are used and what they do, right? So in the first line, we have a very basic combo of skill 1, skill 2, skill 3, and then you repeat that same sequence, and then on turn 7 you just ult. That is a very basic and very first combo I found the instance I read her kit. Very simple, very straightforward. It's also her strongest sequence, not the entire 6 moves, but the first 3, 1, 2, 3, as her best rotation before ulting for maximum damage potential. No other sequence will give you as much damage as 1, 2, 3 ult, because no other sequence has the buffs 1, 2, 3 gives together. Her second sequence would be the most used sequence by me right now, which is 2, 2, 3 into the 1, 2, 3 combo. 2, 2, 3 is basically stacking S2's self buff twice, as well as using S3 as the final burst damage at the end of that sequence. So for example, in sweep, I would run 2, 2, 3 and then use S2 twice and then start my ult sequence, which is 1, 2, 3. This sequence allows me to have very, very high constant damage, as well as maintaining the S2 buff / state to go into skill 1, which is the crit buff. Earlier we mentioned that the S1 has so many passives, plus passives / buffs. While in the S2 state, and I combo with S1, I will get a 50% crit chance buff because of the combo, which would allow my S2 and S3 after using S1 to have a much higher chance to crit, which then leads us to having much higher damage potential leading up to ult. So although S3 has a very, very high multiplier for Maki units, obviously, they hate her for whatever reason, she has a very, very well built kit. So her S3 is very potent. Although you'd like to spam it, preferably, you can't. Well, you can, but it's not optimal / efficient for damage. So you're just going to lose damage by spamming S3. So because of that knowledge / information, having S2 into S1 allows my rotation to be much smoother, and I get ult much faster technically because of how my team is set up, right? Later on I'll be discussing teams, etc., how they function, whatnot. The third rotation is also one I've created myself. 1, 2, 3, 3 before going back to 1, 2, 3 ult. The problem with that rotation is it takes longer to ult. A turn extra compared to the very first ult, which is 7 turns. This rotation takes 8 turns to ult. Not because she won't have enough ult gauge, but because we used an extra turn to benefit from the 1-2 combo buff. We abused it on her S3 to get 2 S3s off, 2 buffed S3s. But we still have to do 1-2-3 ult so that we can have as much damage as possible. It's fine to do skill 2 ult if you want to, if you have ult. Not have ult, if you have an ult gauge, just do skill 2 ult, that's fine. If you want to do skill 1, skill 2 ult, that's also fine. But you're missing out on buffs. There's no reason to miss out on buffs if you can do it. That's the problem. You're being inefficient by forcing the rotation. That's the problem. By forcing rotation, you're missing out on damage and you're being very suboptimal with your rotation. There's also a rotation where you do skill 1, skill 3, skill 1 and just spam ult gauge. You just spam ult gauge, seriously. Skill 1, skill 3 has a combo effect where she has 50% ult gauge fill rate bonus just as a passive. Like on her own, she has 50% ult gauge fill rate on her own. That's not mentioning her base regen rate, which is 220 per skill. That's also affected by her ult gauge rate. That's affected, as well as additionally, she has a built-in passive where you get 110 extra ult when doing combo 1 and 3. So when you combo skill 1 and skill 3, you get the ult gauge effect, which is 50% when you add them together. And then skill 3 then generates an additional ult gauge fill. So because of that ult gauge fill, it's not just 110. It's always going to be boosted. It's 50% on top of 110. So it's 165%, not 65%, 165 ult gauge just from doing skill 1, skill 3 as a base. You do skill 1, skill 3, we're not adding the base value of the ult gauge. You get 220 per skill. Imagine, it's 440 per 2 skills plus 110 at base. That's 550 ult gauge minus the buffs. When the buffs are applied, even with buff nerf active, you're looking at a minimum of at least 650 plus ult gauge. It scales all the way up to 800 plus, but the math is wonky. I don't have a calculator on me, so I can't do it right now, but it scales all the way up to like 800 plus in an ideal scenario. If the boss hits her, it's even more ult gauge, as you would expect. It's like pushing near 900 plus ult gauge if the boss hits her twice. That's how far the skill 1, skill 3 combo extends. So you can just rush ult in just 2 skills. If you're using LMS, you're looking at even more ult gauge. You can get ult in like 2-3 turns, shortest time as possible, without using external ult gauge boosters. On her own, she can get ult in like 2-3 turns. Just her, it is possible. I've tried it. Very, very easy to do. There's also 1, 2, 3, 2. You don't have to start with skill 1, but doing like 1, 2, 3, you're getting as much P-Tech buff as possible for S3. Just doing 2, 3 is very inefficient. You're just doing 2, 3, you're getting a little buff from S2 into S3. That's not much. If you're going to do 2, 3, it's better to use S2 twice to get the 70% P-Tech buff so that your S3 hits harder. And then what you do afterwards is use S2 again. When you do that, you get a increased damage taken reduction buff on top of her passive, as well as boosting her evasion rate even further. At a base value, her evasion is 10%. Using S2 increases that to 30% for that turn. And when you use it after using S3, the damage taken reduction effect also increases. So it's a lot of skills and buffs baked into her kit. It's so fun using her and utilizing every part of her kit to get as much as possible. And finally, we have skill 1, skill 2, skill 1. Or simply skill 2, skill 1. This combo gives you a 50% crit chance buff just by using them together. As mentioned before, using skill 1 makes your rotation easier, smoother, it's better, it's more beneficial, it gives more buffs, right? Remember, passive is 30% P-Tech, skill 1, skill 2 is 6% P-Tech. You're having 90% P-Tech active just by using skill 1 and skill 2 together. Skill 2 twice is not as strong, but it's more damage. That's the difference. You do more damage using skill 2 twice because it's a 450% multiplier plus self buff, right? So using skill 2 twice gives you 70%. Skill 1, skill 2 gives you 90% because of the passive, right? Skill 2 twice is 70 plus the passive, which is 100. It's more P-Tech, more damage, right? But just using this gives you more crit rate, hence why I use it in my sweep runs, right? I use skill 2 in my phase 1 to end phase 1, so I get the crit buff going into phase 2, which allows me to clear phase 2 very, very quickly. Clear phase 2 in 4 turns, that's it. 1, 2, 3, ult, and phase 2 is done, right? It's the fastest phase clear in my sweep. Phase 1 takes 5, phase 2 takes 4. Alright guys, so we're going into phase 3, where I'm going to be discussing her rec bits and her team compositions. Right, so there's a lot of rec bits for Taijutsu units that are impactful / amazing for them. At base, the best rec bit she can use is Fukuoka Gathering Exchange. It is a 85% on activation for physical technique, and the passive of the rec bit is unnerfable, which is a very, very nice 20% increase in crit. Cannot be affected by tower nerf, and it is a full taijutsu stat rec bit. Very, very lovely. It's the non-standard of physical technique units. Another example would be like Fuga's rec bit from his banner. It's also just like it, except the passive is unnerfable. Second best rec bit would be Like-Minded Sisters. Maki's on cover, of course, is good for her. Passive is absolutely insane. 200 ult gauge for the unit. Once the unit crits on their turn, as mentioned before, it's possible to get like really, really quick ults with this rec bit, but it doesn't change much for her. It doesn't change her life compared to 2 other rec bits I'm going to be mentioning after this that I don't have. I couldn't put them on the tier list. They weren't there actually. So yeah, it's the same as Fukuoka, 85% on activation, but it's not full P-Tech. It's actually split between C-Tech and HP, so it's more bulk but less base stats, right? Play of the Strong, OG rec bit from day 1. Very, very strong. Main skill, 60% P-Tech buff for 2 turns, full P-Tech stats on the rec bit, but the passive is useless. Utterly garbage. You will never activate it. You have passive, well, not passive, you have built-in evasion. You can buff your own evasion, so you don't need the passive of the rec bit, and it's just not that insane. The other 2 rec bits that I really need to mention here is the Gojo, or not Gojo rec bit, the Toji rec bit from Domain Gojo's rerun banner is absolutely insane for Maki. It's built for her. It has a passive of 20% P-Tech buff to the units once they have less than 20 CE, I believe. Full P-Tech stats, and on activation it gives 50% P-Tech buff. It's not much, but when paired with the passive, which is always active, you get 70% P-Tech buff for 2 turns. It's better than Play of the Strong, better passive. The main skill is weaker, but it's stronger when paired with the passive that you can use. Play of the Strong passive cannot be used, but the main skill is just as strong. That's the difference. Another rec bit that should be in S tier would be 0.2 Domain Gojo's rec bit from his banner. It is absolutely insane, that rec bit. I needed the rec bit, but I couldn't get it. But that's how life is. It's 95% P-Tech on activation plus 20% allied damage for 3 turns. What that means is on activation, she gets 95% P-Tech for her ult, and then afterwards she receives more damage buff on top of her already built-in damage buff after co-op ulting. For example, when I co-op ult with Inumaki and her, she received a 45% damage buff because of her co-op buff. With that and the rec bit, she receives a 65% damage buff for her S3 afterwards. So I'll just pop ult, the co-op ult, and then pop S3 afterwards for insane damage. So that buff would last for 2 extra turns after ulting, which would make my life so much easier in sweep, removes a lot of RNG, and it allows me to do even more damage because the buff applies to everyone on the team. So since it applies to everyone on the team, that applies to Ghetto, that applies to Maki, and once they have their buffs, they're going to do more damage. More damage equals more break damage. More break damage equals the boss breaks faster, then takes more damage, right? We love damage. Damage is fun. Moving on. In A tier, we have Nameless Youth. Very good rec bit, but the conditional will never activate. Maki will not die, the resurrection won't activate, and you will never unlock the secondary requirement of the main skill, which needs you to be below 50% HP. It's impossible, you won't activate it. Maki dodges, she has damage reduction, she heals. You won't activate it. It should be lower, but the stats is just as LMS, and the main skill isn't weak. It's 75% on activation. But we can get the other 35% because you'll never be under 50. She has her story rec bit in B tier because it's actually strong for story, but that's it. It sucks for bosses, sucks for sweep, it doesn't do much, it's very weak. It's only 40% on activation, and the passive only activates if you kill something in the wave, which will never happen anywhere else. In C tier, we have Purifying Deities. It's only there because of the passive. The passive buffs Tokyo students. And because she's a Tokyo student, that passive is always active and it can't be nerfed. The main skill is also decent-ish, but the stats of the rec bit is mixed. It's not 70-30 in PTEC favor or anything like that. It's just mixed. So it's less stats at base. The activated skill is only 35% at max, I believe, and that's it. And finally, we have the Nanami bit. Nanami bit gives you 60% CTEC, 60% PTEC once you crit. So even then, it's a conditional where if she doesn't crit, you're just gonna lose 20% PTEC, just like that. It's also mixed, but it's actually in favor of PTEC, like the LMS or Nameless Youth. So it's actually okay in that regard, but the main skill is useless. It's only a crit buff, doesn't buffer damage in any way whatsoever. So it's just so if you have no other options. Other SR bits exist, but you rather just use the SSR bit for the stats, and that's just it. So yeah, that's her situation as regards to rec bits. As I said, the top two rec bits are Toji and Fukuoka. Gojo's rec bit is very situational. I could use it in, like, for example, to nuke phase 3 in sweep or score challenge nukes. Score challenge nukes, I'll always use that rec bit. The 95% is just so strong. It beats Fukuoka in terms of nuke damage easily, and the main skill passive is insane. It's like 3 passives into 1 rec bit. It's absolutely nuts, man. So nuts. Hello guys, welcome to phase 3 and our final phase in this guide video. I didn't expect the video to go on this long. It's been like, what, 35 minutes or so, 30, 38? I don't know, man. It's been a long video, but I don't want to keep you guys in longer. This is where we talk about team comps. Every team comp possible, free to play, non-free to play, garbage units to best units, whatever it is, whatever your case is, we will talk about it here. Of course, in slot 4 we'll have Maki, best rec bit, full stats, full everything, fully maxed out, full investment. She is where she wants to be with everything she needs to function properly. Slot 3 is adjustable. In slot 3, you can have 0.2, you can have Miguel, you can have Maki, you can have Kamo. Whoever your secondary debuffer is goes into slot 3. Best case scenario, we're gonna ignore Gojo and Blueji for now. They're basically interchangeable based on what you need to do. Usually you'll never use them. I didn't pull for 0.2. I don't need it in my life. I'm good. My Maki is basically 5. I clear out content, I'm chill, right? But you should definitely pick up Gojo if you can get him. He's really good. Future proofs your account. Really strong unit. He's busted. Whatever, right? Moving on. Slot 3, you'd ideally have Miguel. Miguel, because if he has the rec bit I mentioned earlier, the I will follow you Nanami bit, that bit plus his passive will give you an insane amount of Taijutsu stat buff, which you will need later on into the game. Blue doesn't have a stat buffer for Jujutsu at all. All we have are debuffers and DPS. That's it. Momo is on her last leg. She's old. She's dying. Her back hurts. We can't use her anymore, right? So, Miguel in slot 3. Slot 2 is interchangeable. Again, slot 2 can be Maki, it can be Kamo, it can be Geto, it can be Yaga. Both versions can be Momo, can be Degumi, can be Domain Gojo, the red version. Can be so many units, right? But usually, best case scenario, again, you'd have Inumaki in slot 2. Inumaki and Miguel are your main stat debuffers. They debuff for physical technique damage taken, and that's where all your damage is coming from. Miguel and Maki. Miguel is just supportive damage. He will never do half of what Maki is doing. He'll just do like maybe 35% or more. But Maki is your main source of damage. You do everything to give her damage. That's it. And then finally in slot 1, this is where you have Geto, best case scenario. If you can afford her premium team, it would be Geto, Inumaki, Miguel, and her in that order. That would be your perfect scenario where you have those 4 units. You will never lose. You can't lose with that team. And it's just very, very fluid. No cursed energy issues. Except Inu, where you need to bring a cursed energy regen rec bit, for example, Imaginary Youth, and you'll be fine. You S3 forever, boss dies quickly, boom, bang, bang, whatever the hell, right? And then that's her premium team. The substitute for each slot, very, very interchangeable, as I've said before. Slot 3 can be 0.2 Gojo to come out for Miguel, where you wouldn't need Miguel early on. 0.2 covers the lost buffing and lost damage by doing his own damage, as well as leaving a debuff on the boss when he ults and dips, right? So he covers the lost damage you need to get from Miguel plus the buffs by doing his own damage to cover, right? He covers the lost damage. Another scenario would be where you don't have 0.2, but you have Blue G. Blue G is what? A3, maybe A4, whatever he is. Put him in slot 3. He supports Maki by buffing her alt gauge for whatever reason. He can debuff with his S2. He can taunt, be a meat shield, whatever he needs to be, right? He would be in slot 3, and you'd have Inumaki and Geto. What if you don't have any of those 2 units? Well, or Miguel, you can use Kamo. Kamo can swap with Inumaki to go in slot 2 instead of slot 3, because you wouldn't need to ult with Kamo if it's a taijutsu only floor, or if it's a both floor, not both floor, it's a mixed floor where you can use any DPS type. He can go in slot 3, where we just ult with Maki and get as much damage as possible. But in that scenario, it would be better to just run a C-Tech DPS, for example, Kamo or Yuta. They have state buffs that can be nerfed. They can be whatever they want to be. Kamo is AIDS. Kamo, Yuta, AIDS. Whatever. Moving on. Slot 1. This is where you'd have your stat buffer, damage debuffer, damage buffer, right? So you have 3 possible units for this slot. You can have SR Yaga, Geto, or Momo. There's other options, but they're niche / situational. For example, Domain Megumi. His S1 is perfect for slot 1 purely because it's just a lot of damage. Damage taken debuff, he scales to 299% at max level. And it would multiply with your stat debuffs and your stat buffs, giving you as much damage as possible. You nuke on the last turn of his domain. The boss takes 50 million damage, he dies, he disappears, whatever it is, right? Very, very strong unit, but very, very situational, as Degumi does not work in blue content. He gets nuked to oblivion. He dies immediately, right? His domain doesn't help him either, because blue sweep ignores domain. All hard sweeps ignore domains, as well as attack immunity. They just bypass it. The bosses have, I don't even know, these bosses or whatever, right? So he can be changed. If you're broke, have no money, you are from the trenches of O Block, you run SR Yaga, SR Nanami with SR Gaku. That is your default setup. If you're broke and have no money, you're just in the trenches. You have no life. You're unemployed. You're homeless, right? If you have nothing, that becomes your scenario. There's also scenarios where you can run Mai. You run the twins together. Why not? Mai is exceptional debuffer. Constantly debuffing, doesn't run out of cursed energy. Very CE positive, as well as she's somewhat tanky if you use the right rec bits. For example, if you run Doc Pride, she has like 40k plus health at A1. Even at A0 is like 30k plus, which is it's okay. But she's still squishy-ish at A0. A1 is where everyone shines. Everyone shines at A1. So she has possible uses at in some scenarios where possible, like tower. But sweep is a bit situational. I've tried team comps with her. It doesn't work as well as you want it to, but it's just fun to use. Fun to use if you're not running a buffer. You just run full debuffers. Every turn my debuffs, it just gets stronger and stronger and stronger. And then she just scales, especially when she ults. When Maya pops her ult, it's a significantly higher debuff, and it just scales to 270%, I believe. But it's not as much as compared to Degumi or Domain Gojo, his red version. Speaking of Domain Gojo, his red version, his red version is really strong when paired with Domain Megumi, right? So you'd ult with Dijo first, and then Megumi afterwards, so you'd apply 2 domain effects. So on the 4th turn of Domain Gojo's domain, where it's going to end, that's the turn where you nuke. So you'd have a stack of Degumi's S1 and then 2 stacks of the S3, which will give you 120% damage taken increase for physical technique, on top of the 420% damage taken increase flat from their domains being mixed, which is a very, very potent number, but it's very situational when trying to nuke with her. It's a very unique scenario, but it's fun to use when you can use it. I used it in like a couple of limited floors back when they actually made blue Taijusa floors, but nowadays it's like actual Taijusa floors, which I love to see. I love to see blue Taijusa floors. She hasn't gotten any time to shine except now. Like recently, they're doing a lot of Taijusa floors. She's really fun. I love them. But yeah, she didn't have time to shine before, but now she does. Moving on. She has some niche units that she works well with. Her uncle Naobito, he does buff. He does buff for blue units, albeit absolutely spit on a fire buff. It does nothing, but it's there. It's just 15%, I think. It can be stacked twice to 30% if he's able to do it twice. It's possible, but that's it. He's just a sub DPS. He could go in the sub DPS slot, but he's very niche. Very, very, very niche. There's also Yellow Mekamaru. There are times when you can run him. For example, floor 74, if you're still there for whatever reason, you're there. You can use him. After you kill the main boss, he taunts the boss on the left, counters, applies a debuff, and you can use that debuff to do more damage. And that's basically it for him. Miwa is the same thing as Mekamaru, but her counters do nothing but just counter. That's it. They counter, she does a bit of damage. If she crits, she's able to counter longer. And then lastly, her ult. Her ult has a physical technique debuff, which is very, very helpful in times where you need it. If you're using her, for example, last month, I used her for limited floor 2. I think it was LF2 again. Yeah, LF2 again last month was blue, right? I used her, I got a 30 turn clear. It was very fun. But the boss was really annoying. It's such an annoying boss. I hate that boss. It's so annoying, man. I didn't know it. Anyways, right? It was nice to use her. The ult helped a lot with the damage after doing the combo ult. It gave us so much damage because of the debuff, and the S3 afterwards that Maki uses is very potent. It does like 6 mil plus. It's very nice. And then in the Maki, his SR version is basically Miwa, but just much worse in the sense where it's less counters, but his counters apply a debuff. That debuff being a physical technique increased debuff, which is very, very nice. For example, on floor 66, I believe, I used him and it was very fun to use. He basically counted every turn and the boss just died. It just died. It was fun. Counter the boss, apply debuff, boss dead, move on. Right? Very simple. Very niche units, but when used properly, they're very strong. And as usual, you have your sacrifice units, Kaito, Maki, and Saki. Saki for score events, as mentioned earlier, when you're using, like, for example, the main Megumi, he's best for score. Uncontested, he's been in score challenge for every color since launch, except red. I think red has no real use for him currently, but everyone else uses him because he's just so strong, right? Kaito, to give your main debuffers your cursed energy pool, make them spam their debuffs longer. For example, in Maki and Miguel, they really would like to have Kaito if possible. If not, then you'd have to skip debuffing for like a turn or two, and then you can start from there. It just allows you to debuff constantly from turn 1 onwards without any worry. Or buff for that matter. For example, Momo or Yaga, having them with the cursed energy buff for the 2 turns really changes your playstyle. You're able to buff infinitely without worry, and you have the highest damage consistently. Inumaki is very simple. You get ult gauge, he dies, and that's it. He allows you to ult at a quicker sequence, quicker rotation, and it just gives you a smoother clear in times when needed. And that's basically all you'd want him for. Otherwise, he's pretty much nothing. Pretty much useless. And if you use our Inumaki, of course, you can use blue one. The blue one's the best in slot, so it's just a waste at times. It's better to just use Kaito, get your cursed energy up, and your regular blue Inumaki does his job perfectly fine. So that's it. Yeah, that's basically it for her team comps. I'll be doing Green Maki's guide video eventually. I will not make a promise for a time frame, but I will be doing it because I hope she gets buffed soon. She deserves a buff. She needs the buff. She has been forgotten in the dumpster. She needs a buff. Her kid needs so much help. So much help, man. But yeah, thanks for watching, guys. Let me know in the comments if I missed anything or any pointers, and I'll see you guys again in another video.